Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video lecture for research methods. And so in this video lecture, we're going to be talking about case studies. So let me jump right in. Okay, so we got case studies, and the reading for today is actually quite an interesting reading by a Danish geographer, Bent Flivberg, and his book, a section from his book called Power and Rationality, which is about the creation of a bus depot. So it sounds uninteresting, but it's actually kind of fascinating reading. I would have liked to given you the whole book to read, but that would have been too cruel of me. And so even though it's a really fascinating book, it's, I don't want to assign a whole book for one class. But I'm going to talk a little bit about it in the section of reading that you have. Okay. So what are we going to be talking about today? What am I going to be talking about today? So first, kind of just the basics of the case study method. Then I'm going to talk about a little bit about types of cases. What are case studies used for? And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the reading, rationality, and power. Okay, so what is a case study? So really, a case study is an in-depth examination of a single case, right? And that case can be an event, it can be a social group, it can be a certain place, right? And so an important thing here is really the in-depth part, right? That it's an intensive analysis of one thing, right? And so what you're really trying to get at is a richness of detail. You're really trying to really understand the case fully, right? So you have this one thing that you're looking at and you're trying to get a kind of a complete kind of understanding of how that thing works and why it is the way it is. And so if you remember, if we go back to that discussion of nomothetic versus ideographic, right? So nomothetic being the creation of general laws for a certain class of phenomenon, whereas ideographic being the study of one thing. Case studies are really ideographic, right? They are, the exemplar of ideographic research. It's understanding it and really examining and analyzing one single event or one single thing in the world. And so how do you do that, right? Basically we're going back to this idea of thick description again, right? So, and this is why it is kind of paired this week with this idea of participant observation or ethnographies. And there's a certain degree of overlap between these two things, right? And so if you remember, a thick description is, kind of really this giving a rich, detailed description of your thing, right? Giving an intensive study of it. And so ethnographies did that by the researcher living with the people that they are studying. And case studies, they can do that, but there's other there's other ways to get at that richness of detail. And so there is a very much a similarity between case studies and ethnographies, but case studies don't need to be the researcher living with a social group. But the central point still is to have that rich description, to have that kind of complete understanding of what the case is about, right? And so, right, if it's not an ethnography, how do you do this? Essentially, case studies often use a kind of a mixed method approach, right? To get that richness of detail, they're going to get at the case in many different ways. And so we see this in the rationality and power reading, right? And so what Bent Flipberg did in his study, is in his case study of Alberg, is he used interviews, he used content analysis of documents, he used participant observation of going to meetings, right? And so he really, he used this mixed method approach, kind of getting at the case by using all your different techniques, right? And so case studies really are actually a good example of that mixed method, right? So that you're getting and you're studying the case from different angles and from different approaches. But again, the overall or general idea is you're having that richness of detail, right? That you are really having a thick description, right? That you are describing in complete as way as possible what that case is like. So you're describing it, how it came to be, right? So you're describing its evolution, right? Its progress through time. You're describing how that case works within its environment. That case, that event, that place, that social group is not just a lonely island. It is situated in a bigger landscape. And so you're trying to show, how does that case, how is it placed in that landscape, right? So we have a case study is an intensive study of a particular case. We have it as, how do you do this? You do an intensive description, a thick description, typically using a mixed method approach. Now we can ask, well, why do a case study? What's the purpose of doing a case study? So I want to say a couple of things. So the first thing is to say, well, okay, you do a case study because you want to know about the case, right? And that may seem obvious, but it needs to be said, right? That there are, cases out there in the world want to be described. We want to understand the things for the thing itself, right? So, for example, one of the examples I'm going to give you of a case study is the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? A certain event. And so we might ask, well, why do we want to do a case study of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Because we want to understand the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? That we do case studies because the case itself is important to understand. You could do a case study of the French Revolution. Why? Because you want to understand the French Revolution, right? And so the first thing to say is we study cases because the case itself is important, right? There's something about the case that the thing you're studying that is useful for people to know, right? So that's the first thing that's to be said. So beyond that general idea that you study a case because the case itself is important, why do a case study? And I would say two things. The first thing is we study cases in order to create theories, right? Going back to the first part of the class, there's this kind of inductive approach. How do you create a theory? How do you kind of start to understand the social world? A good way to start is to start studying one thing in depthly, right? And so case studies are often used descriptively, right? They are used to describe a case, and then from that case to create a theory, to begin to understand how humans in general and how the social world in general operates, right? So you can first create a theory from one specific case, and then what you then do is say, okay, I've got this theory, I've created it from this one case, now let me go out and see if it works for other cases, right? So then you can go out and test it. Okay, so that's the first thing, right? So you can use a case study to test to create a theory. Second is you can also use a case study to test a theory, right? That case studies are not just useful for creating theories, they're also useful for testing a theory, right? So let's say you have a theory, right? You have some theory about how the social world works, and you want to see if it's valid or not, right? You can actually test that theory by using a case study. So you go out and apply that theory and you see if it works. Does it work in this case, right? And if it does, then it lends support to the theory. But if it doesn't, then it, to some degree, kind of invalidates it. And so case studies are useful both for understanding the case itself, for creating theories, but also then for testing them. Okay, this is all a little bit abstract, so let me kind of give a little bit more detail by talking about some examples of case studies within sociology. And so what we can see is that sociology has a few different examples of case studies, and it shows you how you can do case studies of different types of things. So the first case study we have is of a place, right? So you can do a case study of a geographic location, a place, which is a little bit what Alberg's, Bent Flisberg's study of Alberg is like. So what we have as an example of this is the Middletown studies. And these are actually a kind of quite famous case study within sociology. So it was done by a husband and wife team, Robert and Helen Lind. And what they did was an in-depth study of an anonymous town that they named Middletown, right? And so they named it Middletown to express this idea that it was typical, right? That it was an ordinary, average American town that existed in the 1920s and the 1930s. And so actually they did it twice. They did it once in the 1920s, and then they went back a decade later and did it again to see how the town had changed, particularly because America was going through the Depression. Right. And so the Linds, the husband and wife team, the Linds, really did a case study, right? They did interviews with the people who lived in the town. They looked at the town records. They participated in the town events. They basically lived in this town, for many, many years. And they really kind of gave a rich, detailed understanding of how, how it worked. And, many sociologists have actually used their data because it's incredibly rich. It's book length. There's a lot of stuff in there to use other, to do other research. So, for example, there has been a spin-off where another sociologist, Ted Kaplow, used the Middletown studies to talk about Christmas, right? To talk about the ritual of Christmas in America and why Americans, celebrate this holiday, right? And so it's a good example of kind of a rich, detailed study, right? And so the example of a case study of a certain specific place, and it really is an example of a case study which is supposed to be typical, right? That Middletown is supposed to stand for many places in America. It could be, it even could be Plattsburgh in the 1920s and 1930s, right? That it was a very typical place. And so by understanding Middletown, you didn't just understand this one place, you understood, many or the average American town in America. Okay, so we have a case study of a place, right? Then we have a case study of a social group. And for this, I would go back and talk about In Search of Respect, right? That what Philippe Bourgois is really doing is he's doing a case study, right? He's doing an ethnography that is essentially a case study of a social group, right? These people who are selling crack in East Harlem, right? And so he lived with these people, he interviewed them, he talked with them, he hung out with them. He is essentially doing a thick description, an in-depth case study of this social group, right? This group of crack dealers, and understanding how they live and understanding their lives, right? And it really is fulfilling that idea that it's a rich description of it, right? And so what we can say is actually most ethnographies are themselves case studies, right? So not all case studies are ethnographies, but most ethnographies are case studies, right? So we have a case study of a place, a case study of a social group. Then lastly, we have a case study of an event, right? Something that happens, right? So we can think of an event as, a period of, a thing that happened in a short period of time, right? So for example, there have been case studies of the Challenger spacecraft disaster, or as we see here, the case study of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? And so this was a kind of famous case study by Graham Allison, who wrote a book about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the idea here was actually to test a theory. So it's a really kind of example of this, of a case study that was done to test theory. So up until this point, the theory of international politics was that international actors, like governments, were rational actors, that they went out into the world and they did things benefit themselves, and it was all about game theory, and that actors in the international realm were rational, right? That they didn't get emotional, they didn't get over the health. They simply kind of act in their own best self-interest. And what Allison says is, the Cuban Missile Crisis is a great example, a great case study of an event that essentially falsifies this theory, right? That it showed that both the United States and Cuba and Russia were not rational at all during the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? That they were not acting like rational actors, but really that they got in over their heads, right? And they became emotional over it. It became about pride. And so it's really an example of a case study that does something to disprove a theory, right? That it's not just used to create a theory, but it's a good example of a case study that is able to test the theory and show how that theory might be invalid. And so you have case studies are kind of interesting reads because you really know about that singular event. And again, going back to this argument about nomothetic and ideographic, it really shows you that case studies can serve a scientific purpose, right? That examining one case is actually and can be theoretical, right? And so, my own personal opinion is that they should not be thrown out. That case studies are very important, actually. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what cases are. We talked a bit about how to study them. Now let me talk a bit about the types of cases that you can study. Right, so we've got have some examples of them. Now I can talk more generally about the types of cases that are out there. And what I'll do is maybe link back and talk about how some of the examples are examples of these different types of cases. Okay, so what are the different types? And it's really based off the work of Ben Flipberg, and these are the types of cases that he describes. So the first one is what we can call an extreme or deviant case, right? And this is kind of going back to this idea of a black swan. So if you remember all the way back to the first week of class, and we talked about Popper's theory of falsification, right? Say you're a botanist and you go out and you look at swans all day long. You see swan after swan after swan, and you just see a bunch of white swans, right? And so you have this theory that all swans are white, right? But actually you can't really know that because there are actually black swans out there. And those black swans disprove the theory, disprove the argument that all swans are white. And so black swans are deviant cases that disprove a theory, cases that go against the norm, right? And so they are cases in which you're picking the case because in some way they are extreme, they are unusual, they are atypical, they are against the norm, right? So what would be an example of this? Across the world, adolescence is generally thought of and experienced as a time of emotional upheaval, right? Tends to be stressful. People start to question their place in the world. They are trying to form relationships, friendships, social networks. There's a fight over status. Being a teenager, being an adolescent is quite stressful. But there is one place in the world where it's actually not like that at all. And that is actually Samoa. And so there's a famous case study of Samoa by Margaret Mead in her work, Coming of Age in Samoa. And so what Margaret Mead does, and Flipberg says that it's actually an example of a case study. It's an ethnography, but it's a case study. He says that, that this is actually an example of an extreme or deviant case. A place in the world where being a teenager is quite relaxing. It's not emotional. There's no period of upheaval. It's not stressful, right? And so Margaret Mead really examines how being an adolescent in Samoa is actually quite normal and peaceful, and people quite enjoy it. It's quite kind of easygoing. And so that's an example of a deviant case, a case that is unusual. And so the idea is by studying these unusual cases, by studying these cases that are atypical, right, then you can actually understand what is normal, right? By understanding what is deviant, you can understand what is normal. And so that the deviant case doesn't just tell you about the case that's deviant, it actually tells you about all the other cases that are normal. You can see what is different between the deviant case and the normal case. And so the important thing to understand is that by studying a deviant case, you can understand the more general phenomenon of what is normal. Okay, so that's the first thing. So deviant cases, block norms. What I would also say is the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? That is also an example of a deviant case, right? It's an example of a case in which international actors were not rational, right? Mostly, most wars are actually irrational, or most, military conflicts are irrational because some person should really back down, right, if they're being rational. And so the examination of the Cuban Missile Crisis is actually an examination of a case that should never have happened, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis should not happen, should not have happened. It should not have gotten that close. And so it's actually an example of a deviant case. So you understand while these things don't happen by understanding the unusual circumstances in which something like the Cuban Missile Crisis does happen. Okay, so that's our first case, extreme or deviant cases. Next, we have critical cases, right? And so here, a critical case is used to test the theory again, right? But here, you're not so much testing the theory to falsify or invalidate it, which is sometimes used in the deviant or extreme case. But you're really using the case to see how it might work, right? And so Flipberg gives a hypothetical example to describe this type of critical case, right? So let's say that we want to understand if there's some drug out there that's dangerous. Like we want to understand, there's a drug or vaccine or something like that that's being given to people, and we want to understand, does it have any side effects, right? Does it have, will it produce harmful side effects? So we could test this drug in a range of different hospitals, right? We could just randomly select a hospital and test it. But actually, that wouldn't be the best. What we would want to do is test this drug in a hospital that is really up to standard in terms of its standard of care. We want to test this drug in a really good hospital, right? Why? Because we want to know, does this drug, if there are side effects, we want to know that the result of the side effects are from the drug, not from the improper care that is being experienced in the hospital. And so what the idea here is a hospital with a high standard of care is actually a critical case, right? If the drug works there, if the drug is successful there and it has no side effects, then it is an example of that the drug would work in other hospitals and other places. Lastly, we have a paradigmatic case, right? And so here, this is an example of a case that is actually the complete opposite of a deviant case, right? Here it's a study, a case that is typical, right? A completely normal case, right? And so you're describing a case that is the average or norm. So what would be an example of this? The Middletown case study that I described before, right? So the Middletown studies are actually paradigmatic, right? That when the Lynn studied Middletown, what they were saying is, this is, by studying Middletown, we're studying the average town in America, right? And the whole purpose of this is not just to know something about Middletown, but it's to know something about all American towns. And so if Middletown is the average or norm, then by doing a case study of this one town, we can actually find something out about all towns. Right? And so that's what I would say. The paradigmatic cases is for studying often what is typical. And so what we can see here is that case studies can be used in many different ways, right? That there's many different ways to use a case study. There's different types of case studies, like a place, a group, an event, but there's also many different ways to use it. Okay, now let me talk about the reading. And let me kind of give you some background about this reading. And so after you've read it, or if you still have to read it, you can kind of get a little bit more of a understanding of what's going on here. Okay, so Ben Slidberg is a academic. He's actually a geographer who lives in Denmark. Right, he studies and works in Copenhagen, but he did a case study of a town called Aalborg, which is about an hour outside of Copenhagen. And so what was happening in Aalborg is that urban planners were putting in a new transportation system, a new bus route, right? And so they had to create a whole new system of bus routes, and they had to create a bus depot, right? A place where all the buses would come to, like a central hub where the buses would come to and the buses would leave, right? And so you might think, oh, this sounds pretty boring, right? It's a study, it's a whole book, a case study of buses and the creation of a bus depot and like local town urban planning. But it's actually incredibly fascinating because what Slidberg is able to look at is, how does politics work at the local level, right? How does politics work at the local level? And so he is able to describe, it's a good example of a few things. He gives a really good in-depth description, right? The book is very long. I only give you a short section from it, but even from that short section, hopefully you're able to see the in-depth, rich, thick description that he's able to give. So he uses mixed methods, right? So he uses interviews, he interviews people. He does a content analysis of documents. There's mountains and mountains of documents about this bus depot, right? He attends meetings. He does this participant observation. So he kind of tackles the case from all different angles, and he really describes it in this incredibly rich detail, right? And it's amazing, but it's also a little bit depressing because you can see how shady the politics are, right? That the people involved are, in some sense, don't have the town's best interest at heart. That the various players are very self-interested, right? So you have the Chamber of Commerce, you have the local government, you have the Aalborg Bus Company, and there's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes, right? And so it's a little bit depressing in some sense that you get to see this kind of, you get to pull back the curtain and you get to see how kind of, untrustworthy a lot of these politicians were, right? Okay, so it has rich description, it has a thick description, but it doesn't just have thick description, it's also about theory, right? That what Slidberg says is, what Ben Slidberg says is, he's really giving you a theory here, that this case study of this one urban planning event really shows you how all local politics works, right? So what's his theory, right? So if you remember, what is a theory? A theory is simply we have one social phenomenon connected to another social phenomenon, right? These two things are related in some way, and typically a causal relationship. And so Slidberg has this, he has actually this in his book. And so basically what he says is, as the power of a social group goes up, the more they're able to be less rational. The more power, the less rationality, which is kind of really interesting, right? And so the more powerful a group is, the less rational that they have to be. And the reverse is also true, right? If you're less powerful, now you have to be more rational. You really have to back up your argument. You have to prove your arguments because you're coming from a place of weakness, right? And so what he says actually is he makes a distinction between rationality and rationalizations. And it's a really interesting distinction. So he says, okay, what is rationality? Rationality is when a social group thinks about a problem, right? They think it through, right? They have a problem, they think it through, they consider all the possible solutions, they weigh the pros and cons, and then they decide to choose an action that has the greatest benefit, right? The least cost with the greatest benefit, all right? That's rationality, right? That's, you're going to do the thing that is going to be the least costly and give you the most benefit, right? That's kind of a prototypical example of being rational, right? So you think about it first, and then you make a decision based on a rational argument about what's the best thing to do. Flipberg says, okay, let's contrast that with this idea of rationalization, right? Rationalization is actually the reverse. Rationalization is you have power, and so with that power, you don't have to be rational, and you just go ahead and make a decision. You're like, okay, this is what I want, right? And I can get what I want because I have power, right? So you make a decision, right? Now what you have to do is you have to defend that decision. You have to explain why you acted, right? And so that explanation is not a rationality, that's a rationalization, right? You have made a decision, and it wasn't made by a rational choice, it was just made because that's what you wanted, but now you have to explain your decision. The explanation of your decision is a rationalization. And so basically what Flipberg says is, if you have less power, then you have to have rationality, right? You have to be rational first and then make a decision. If you have more power, then you can have rationalization. You go ahead and get what you want, and then you explain your decision afterwards. And so what Flipberg is saying here is, look, this case study is not simply a case study of this one town and this one urban planning event. It's actually theoretical. It's actually allowing us to understand the social world in general, or in a bigger sense. Okay, so we can ask, what is this? What kind of case is this? Like, is this an extreme deviant case? Is this a critical case? Is this a paradigmatic case? What Flipberg says is, this is a paradigmatic case, right? That this is the typical way that politics works in local government, right? That it often happens behind the scenes, that there is this charade of appearing rational when it's actually a rationalization, and that this is the way our politics actually happens normally or typically. And so his case study of Aalborg is actually kind of like Middletown, right? That he's describing, this is kind of the typical way things work in the world. Okay, so this is the case studies, right? They're kind of a fascinating. They're usually good, interesting reads if they're done well, but they are examples of doing an in-depth analysis of a single thing that allows you to describe that case fully and give a rich, detailed description of that case, but also B, to tell you about the social world in general. Right, that doing a case study doesn't just allow you to describe that case, but allows you to understand more general phenomenon in the world.